Yeah, it's going to go live soon, inshallah.
Okay, no worries.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dear viewers of the MKSI Leicester YouTube channel, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I welcome you to the fourth session of the series titled An Exposition of Ashura. But before I do that, I apologize for the technical difficulties that we've had, and we've had a slight delay in starting. Nevertheless, here we are resuming our fourth session of the series. Sheikh, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh for the third time. How are you?
Alaikum assalam Muhammad Ali. Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm keeping well. So just to give our dear viewers a little bit of a background and a summary of what we had discussed in our previous session. The previous session, number 3, was titled The Effects and Consequences of Karbala. Now, in the series of an exposition of Ashura, we've of course been discussing, going in depth with Ashura, leading up to the event of Ashura, but more so the aftermath. And in that discussion, we discussed briefly some of the revolutions that had already been mentioned in the Holy Quran. We mentioned the revolutions that took place before the uprising of Imam Husayn alayhi salam against the Umayyads, more so the revolution of the Kharijites, and we discussed why the Kharijites revolution didn't gain as much traction as the revolution of Imam Husayn alayhi salam did. And finally, we also discussed the aim of the Imam in his revolution to separate religion and state. And I guess from Muawiyah's policies, he wanted to kind of combine the two. And of course, with the Imam being Imam Hussein alayhi salam, state and religion can only be done together in the presence of an infallible Imam, as we discussed, and Imam Hussein alayhi salam wanted to separate the two. Sheikh, in light of this, is there anything that you'd like to add to the session that we discussed last week before we resume this week's session?
أحسنت. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله. First and foremost, we thank Allah to give us the opportunity to discuss the events of Karbala, to discuss Ashura. You know, the scholars, they explain that Ashura and what happened on the 10th of Muharram is a madrasa within our madhab, and anything that we discuss has the ability to be linked back to what happened and what transpired on that day. So building on last week's discussion, it's a very intriguing discussion, very, very interesting discussion, where scholars have actually spoken about the effects and the aftermath of how the Bani Umayyah were affected by their behavior in the lands of Karbala. And we spoke about one of the effects last week, which was that the Imam was able to very, very effectively separate state from religion. It's interesting because in this day and age, if you look at Hijaz, for example, state is religion, right? When you have the family that is the ruling party in that land, they have authority over the Haramain, Mecca and Medina. And whatever happens in these Haramain, it's their decision at the end of the day. So if they want to, for example, construct and continue construction, if they want to demolish for whatever reason, they have that authority. They don't, for example, consult any of the Muslimin or any of the leading ulama around the globe. They make that decision internally amongst themselves, right? So we see the effects of religion and state as one in the same thing, even today in this day and age. So when Imam Hussein alayhi salam stood against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, when he stood against the Umayyads, he was able to physically expose the Umayyads for what they truly were, for what they represented, right? So the Muslim nation, when you look at historically the position of Imam Hussein alayhi salam within Medina, within Mecca, within Kufa, he was considered as a prince, right? From the noble family, the grandson of the Holy Prophet. He was a celebrity in a very, very positive perspective, right? He was considered to be a revered personality, a scholar. And people used to constantly go back to the Imam to learn or to even have the ability to be helped by them. So we hear all of these stories where the Imam used to cater for the needs of the people, give them
Yeah.
sadaqah, give them knowledge, and so on and so forth. So their position in the community was established, very, very well established. Now, when they heard what the Banu Umayyah did to such a man with such a reputation, a very, very strong, positive reputation, the brutality that was that transpired against the Imam and his family, it somehow exposed their nature, their true colors, right? It's interesting because when you go to the words of Muawiyah to his son Yazid, in his final testament, he says to his son, he says, Yazid, do not touch Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Don't even go, don't even provoke him, because that will be the downfall of the clan. And that's exactly what Yazid did. Yazid went after blood, he went after vengeance, and obviously as a consequence to that, just a few generations later, the Banu Umayyah were completely destroyed. So
Yeah.
the Imam alayhi salam gives his life. He's killed, he's martyred, his family, not only his family, but his brothers, his children, the infants were slaughtered, right? Um, his companions, his women, and his children, they were taken captives, and no one was shown any mercy from the Banu Umayyah. So um, when people heard about this, when people heard about what had happened to these personalities, let's talk about the companions. The companions, they were scholars, right? You take the example of Burair. They say that when the head of Burair was being shown in public, on top of the lance in the streets of Kufa, the people began wailing. They were saying, this is Burair. This is the person who used to teach us Quran in Masjid al-Kufa. He was known as Qari al-Quran. Likewise, the position of Habib ibn Tahir, Muslim, the Awsajah, these were scholars. Imagine slaughtering scholars and then showing their heads publicly
Mm.
in view of everyone. People took this very, very seriously. People took this very emotionally. When you look at the women were taken in shackles, they were exposed. Um, when you look at the martyrs in Karbala, their bodies were not given rights. Um, People understood the crimes that were committed by the Banu Umayyah, the mistake that they did. Their true colors were now being shown publicly to the people. Before it was covered, before it was behind a veil. But as soon as Yazid comes into power, everything is brought into public. So when you look at, for example, the sermon that the Imam alayhi salam gives on the day of Ashura, right, towards his enemies, he tells them and he makes it very, very clear. Muhammad Ali, if you were to examine these words, the Imam is very, very explicit. He says to them, do not hasten in killing me, do not hasten in your deeds. I have rights on you, and you need to understand that, right? He says to the people, remember my bloodline, know my position. I'm not, I'm the son. Am I not the son of the Prophet's daughter? Am I not the son of the Prophet's cousin? Was my father not the first one to believe in Allah and come towards the religion of Islam? Was my uncle not Hamza, the uncle of my the uncle of my grandfather, who was considered to be Sayyid al-Shuhada in Uhud? You know, did the Prophet not tell his people that me and my brother are Sayyid al-Shabab Ahl al-Jannah? And then he challenges them. He says, if you don't believe me, then go and ask people like Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Adsar. Go ask people like Anas ibn Malik, go ask Zayd ibn al-Arqam, go ask Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, go ask Sahal ibn Sa'id al-Sa'idi. These was noble people in the Arab Peninsula at the time. They were considered to be from, the elderly, the people who were there with the Prophet of Allah. Go and ask them. They heard these words from the Prophet. Do you not accept my words as they are now? Um, and then he tells them, you look towards the left and the right of the world, the east and the west, you will not find another grandson of the Holy Prophet of Allah. You won't find a person like me. Some people say, well, isn't the Imam being a bit arrogant here? No, the Imam is explaining to the people that this is my position in the religion of Islam, and you are now adamant in shedding my blood, right? Um, do you seek revenge? And then he tells them, do you seek revenge for the blood that I've shed? Or do you seek to shed my blood because of certain properties that I've taken and I've damaged, that I'm now being charged with this crime? So interestingly, the Imam challenges them and he reminds them, this is my position. And this is now the sins, or this is now the act that you are now, you're willing to kill me. Um, there are grave consequences that will follow. So this is the Imam's reputation we're talking about, right? This is the Imam's reputation that was very well known in Mecca, in Medina, in Kufa, not so much in Sham, because Sham was now under the, the rulership of the Banu Umayyah. So they were going through a phase of propaganda where they thought that the Ahlulbayt were considered to be the enemies of Rasulullah. But the Muslim empire, looking at Hijaz, Iraq, and so on and so forth, they knew exactly what the position of Imam Hussein was. So when Yazid came and slaughtered him, the people now woke and they said to themselves, well, hold on a second, this is not normal. Something drastically has gone wrong. And so they realized, the Banu Umayyah exposed themselves, the people realized that there is a difference between a political leader and a spiritual leader, a person who leads in Iman and faith. So the Imam was effectively able to separate the two, which obviously had dire consequences later on as well.
Yeah. So with today's fourth session being a continuation of the session that we had last week, discussing the effects and consequences of Karbala, I guess the first question that I'd like to kind of start the discussion with is, you've of course elaborated on how revered Imam Hussein alayhi salam was. Now, for the Shias, of course, he was an Imam, he was an infallible being. But for the wider Muslims, no one doubted his links to the Holy Prophet and his genealogy. No one doubted his nobility. No one doubted his scholarship. And he was respected from every other angle.
Right. Absolutely.
So when the massacre did happen and occurred on the 10th of Muharram, what's the level of guilt that prevailed amongst the people, be it Shias or the wider Muslims that prevailed at the time?
So that's a very interesting. That's the second effect of what happened post Karbala, right? The people, when they realized that this type of a slaughter actually happened, people began to feel very guilty. There was that guilt effect that just overwhelmed the Muslims in general. And there were two things that happened. There were two things that was a consequence of this guilt. Number one, it drove men, especially those who refused to help Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it drove them to seek atonement for their, their blameworthy conduct. So the Imam calls them for help, and they refuse to help the Imam. And then when they heard about what happened in Karbala, the guilt overwhelmed them. They were, overwhelmed with remorse and grief. And naturally, they wanted to try and repay back. They try and compensate what they had lost out on. That was the first effect. The second effect is that it agitated the Muslims. It created emotions of hatred and disgust, specifically towards the Banu Umayyah, right? For what they did, the way they did. And hatred towards the Banu Umayyah kind of grew, and it went out of control. So historically, scholars explain that many of the revolutions that take place after Karbala, the driving force behind these revolutions was the agitation of anger and passion towards the Banu Umayyah, against the Banu Umayyah, right? So you had small, multiple or multitudes of different revolutions and uprising, and the fuel behind that was the anger towards the Banu Umayyah. And scholars even go on to explain that the reason why they failed in trying to topple the Banu Umayyah is because of the fuel, right? Anger is not a true spiritual motive to rise against the tyrant. It's a consequence of rising against the tyrant, but it's not a pure reason that will bring about victory. Not only that, but when you look at, for example, there's so many different factors. When you compound them, you realize that it all fueled the anger of the people. So when you look at, for example, the sermon of Bibi Zainab salamullah alayha in Kufa, she delivers a powerful sermon. Again, it brings tears to the hearts of the people, the Kufans, and she rebukes them. She has a go at them severely. They begin to cry. They begin to shed tears. And after the sermon is finished, this is interesting. After the sermon finishes, Ibn Ziyad and some of the Banu Umayyads, what they did was they responded to her sermon, and they responded by mocking her. So they recited a few lines of poetry mocking the Holy Lady Zainab al-Kubra. And when the people heard this, people got even more agitated. The people got even more angry, right? They had just heard a sermon, a very powerful, eloquent sermon as if it's the Imam, the same Imam that ruled in that land just a few decades before, right? They testified that this is the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen coming from his own daughter. They were reminded by the Imam, they were reminded by that just ruler that they so much loved, right? And when they heard the entire sermon, when they heard the mocking words of Ibn Ziyad and his Umayyads, it made them even more angrier, because they realized that, hold on a second, these are our leaders, and this is how they respond to such a sermon. So interestingly, Bibi Zainab gives her sermon, and then obviously Imam al-Sajjad gives his sermon, his very eloquent, very powerful sermon. And then of course it repeats itself in Sham as well, when she delivers her sermon, and then Imam al-Sajjad delivers his sermon. So naturally what happened was, people from far and wide begin to listen to what happened in Karbala. The news reaches them. And as the news spreads far and wide, it captures the hearts of the people. You look at the city of Medina. When Medina found out what happened to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the whole city just went into the state of grief and mourning, right? Again, you're talking about a very eloquent, very powerful person who's just been taken away from them, referring to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So the guilt never died, right? It fueled, for many of them, it fueled their angers and their emotions, and it constantly pulled them towards different revolutions and uprising as vengeance, as revenge towards the Banu Umayyah. So that's one of the effects that that transpired after Karbala.
And arguably Muawiyah was, at the end of the day, a very shrewd ruler who had a very strong grip in the land of Damascus. So with the amount of time that he had the grip, although there were some people who saw his policies as black and white, there were many that were still sitting on the fence. And I think the Imam Hussein alayhi salam's revolution cleared the confusion for the majority of the Muslim Ummah, who kind of saw the clear black and white against Imam Hussein alayhi salam and Yazid, and that just fueled their guilt and grief.
So that's interesting, right? So the revolutions that came after Karbala didn't necessarily take place physically, where people used to stand up with swords and fight against others. It happened through words. People began to narrate what happened in Karbala. The soldiers that were active in Karbala, they went to their homes from far and wide. They began narrating their stories, their wives and their families, and people they were much more attracted towards the movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And naturally, what happened was, this began to break the authority of the Banu Umayyad, right?
Yeah.
So there's an interesting narration that says that when the head of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was sent to Yazid, and as soon as it reached Yazid, Yazid was so overjoyed. He was so happy of his, accomplishment. But as soon as the head reaches him, the head of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam reaches him, the people began to curse him, because they realized what a mistake he had done. And by listening to the la'an of the people onto him, he then began to regret, right? So automatically, the grief just overtook the people.
Yeah.
And obviously, this acted as a fuel towards the downfall of the Banu Umayyah. Slowly, it kind of dismantled their power from within.
Yeah. And once the grief and the guilt materialized amongst the people, what sort of actions did it bring about, especially the actions that were immediate, that came about from all corners of the Muslim empire?
So some of the immediate actions that naturally took place was that, it's interesting, because the scholars, they say that Imam al-Sajjad, Bibi Zainab, took opportunity of this, kind of used this as a catalyst to turn the people away from the Banu Umayyah, right? So interestingly, when you talk about the role of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam after Karbala, and he does this beautifully. He goes back to the city of Medina and he cries. And we hear this in his Masai, right? Imam just is in total grief for decades, until the final moments of his life. He never forgets what happened to him in Karbala. And he cries and he cries and he cries. And when the people realize this, when the people see this, naturally they were more attracted towards the Ahlulbayt. We have narrations to this, yeah? We have narrations which explain that, when people would meet the Ahlulbayt, they would tremble from within. Spiritually, the awe and the aura of the Ahlul Bayt would affect them. Now imagine when you have an infallible who is just in a state of grief, constant grief. People were naturally attracted to this. They were naturally attracted. They were more sympathetic towards the imams, towards the Ahlulbayt, and then that hatred naturally grew towards the Banu Umayyah. When that hatred grew towards the Banu Umayyah, you know, their sense of authority just depleted in the hearts of the people. Yeah, they were ruling, they were tyrants, they were killing, they were showing their power and their might over the people, but from within the people realized that, no, hold on a second. There's a very vast difference between a ruler ruling over us and a ruler having authority over our religion and our iman,
Yeah.
right? So that authority of the Banu Umayyah just depleted very, very quickly in the hearts of the people.
Okay, and straight after the massacre that took place, after the Battle of Karbala, of course, the one of the first things that the army did was parade Imam Sajjad and the women folk, city to city, village to village, all the way from Karbala, Kufa, and of course, ending in Sham.
Yeah,
This, of course, gave the Ahlul Bayt, especially Imam Sajjad and Sayyida Zainab, opportunities to also speak and engage with the masses.
yeah,
And that, of course, fueled the grief even further.
yeah,
I mean, the example that comes to mind is after the sermon of Sayyida Zainab in Kufa, bin Afif, who was a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam, a blind companion, spoke out against the ruler. So,
yes, yes.
of course, this was a platform that Imam Sajjad and Sayyida Zainab used to the fullest. Um, are there any implications or direct implications that came about from the sermons of Sayyida Zainab and Imam Sajjad that fueled the grief even further?
So I think one of the greatest effects of Karbala and the aftermath of Karbala was that it allowed the people to, um, try and prioritize what's important in their lives,
Yeah.
right? To show a level of appreciation that never existed before, to try and create a level of awareness that wasn't there before. Um, you have to look at history, right? History 20 years prior to what happens in Karbala. When you look at the time of Imam Hassan alayhi salam, Imam Hassan, I think he was the first person, the first Imam to go through this physically, go through these trials and tribulations. So to, you know, buy off his commanders. Imam Muawiyah was able to, buy the loyalty of the people. And obviously this happens even before at the time of Imam Hassan, in the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam as well. Loyalty was bought and sold. People had become very, very cheap, right? It was all about tribal values more so than religious values. Religion, for the sake of religion, didn't hold any value amongst these people. They were very easily able to sell their own conscience. Um, so on the one hand, the people they saw the tyrannical regime of the Banu Umayyah. They saw what was happening, the killing and the bloodshed and so on and so on. They saw how wicked they were, but they didn't care enough to get involved. And people in general, they were very much willing to sacrifice their families, their tribes, be suppressed or suppress others, be in the state of humiliation, deprive their communities any resources to advance further, just for the sake of them having access to wealth and power within the communities. It was a case where people were very much running after the world. Imam Ali alayhi salam has a beautiful sermon where he talks about this. He says, there are people who will exhaust their own efforts. They will exhaust their energy for the sake of this world. But if only they had focused on the hereafter, imagine what they could have accomplished, right?
Yeah.
And this went on for so long that the young children that were growing up in the tribes saw their leaders of these same tribes behaving in this way, right? Betraying others for the sake of their own benefit. And so this behavior as a whole became normalized. It became so much normalized that to betray a higher goal, to forsake religion just for the sake of darahim and dinars and dananirs, for the wealth of the world was perfectly normal. It was acceptable. When the imam makes a stand, right, this joggles their whole mind. completely. They're shaken from within, right? Because now they've seen a man who has just given his life, a man who has given not just his life, but the lives of his brothers, his innocents, um, a man who has actively put his women in the state of, shackles and chains. When they saw this, when they heard the narratives, they said, well, hold on a second. Why did he do what he did? What motives did the man have? What motives did Imam Hussein alayhi salam have for him to do such a thing? Because they had never seen anyone give their lives selflessly for the sake of Islam. Someone to give their blood and, something which is, like their children and their brothers and something so much of value for the sake of religion is something unheard of, something completely unheard of. Um, so what happened in Karbala was completely the opposite of what they were raised with, the values that they were raised with, right?
Okay.
This question that they would ask themselves was, who would choose death and deprivation over life and just having the ability to live regardless of who the ruler is? Because remember, a lot of people began to think that Imam Hussein did have a choice. He had the choice to, give bay'at or fight. But then for them, it was much easier to give bay'at because who would want to fight and be killed? Um, right? Who would want to give up the comforts of this world for a higher value? So when Karbala took place, it kind of shook the people from within, allowed them to understand that no, at times you really do need to fight for a higher value, right? You, there is honor, there is dignity, there is freedom, there is liberation, there are principles, there are disciplines. But that at times comes through sacrifice. And they were able to understand that when Imam Hussein alayhi salam gave his life for the sake of Islam. Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyah, his very famous conversation he has with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He says to Imam Hussein, he says, look, you're outnumbered. Come on, you have 72 members. We have thousands. If you fight, you're definitely going to be killed. You're going to be overpowered. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded you to safeguard your life. This is the most valuable, priceless asset you have in your hands. And interestingly, the Imam replies, he says, Hor, are you threatening me with death? He says, are you trying to scare me with death? It's like death for us is a change of clothes. It's the inevitable, right? And then he repeats this statement over and over again in the whole saga of Karbala, where he says, a noble death is far better than a humiliating life. To be killed in the way of God is far better than being suppressed by a evil ruler. And a person like me will never give allegiance to a person like him. So the Imam constantly sticks to his values. He sticks to his principles. Not only that, but when the people began to listen to the saga of Karbala, leave aside Imam Hussein alayhi salam, they saw the companions and how much love the companions had for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, that they too were willing to give their lives away. Not only the companions, but even the women, right? The famous Masa'ib of Abdullah ibn Umar, the newlywed, right? The newlywed, when his wife did not allow him to go and fight, and his his mother would tell him to go and fight. In the end, his wife says, "Okay, you know what? Just because we've just gotten married doesn't mean that you can go and you don't go and fight. Go and give your life for Imam Hussein alayhi salam." And he goes, he fights, and he is slaughtered. He gets killed, gets martyred. When he is martyred, his wife goes and she sits alongside his body, and she begins to weep. And the narrations say that when Shimr saw her, he points to one of his men and he says, go sort this out. And the man comes behind this woman and strikes her on the head, and she dies on the spot. Now, when people hear this in the Arabian Peninsula, when the people heard this, that this was the behavior conducted towards a woman, this is a normal woman. This is not, someone like Bibi Zainab. This is a very, very normal woman like any other woman in Arabia. When they heard this, they realized that no, it is possible to give one's life for a higher value. So essentially, the Imam alayhi salam created this basira amongst the people, created foresightedness. He created and he revived a new layer of ethics, which surpassed their version of ethics, which was run after the dunya work, towards the dunya, towards the wealth, the dollars and the pounds. He raised the standards and allowed the people that no, it's not just the world that you should look after. It should be the hereafter that um, you should yearn for. And at times, you should never compromise religion for this world. Never subdue towards corruption and evil. Try and work for a higher goal. And so when the people heard about Karbala, they realized this. They realized that at times it's very much necessary to fight for a higher goal. And that's exactly what happened, right? All of these small,
Yeah.
small revolutions. People were very willing to give their lives.
So arguably, the three cities of the time, the most prominent cities, namely, or states rather, Sham, Kufa, and Hijaz. Now, these three places held considerable power amongst the people and within the empire.
Yeah.
What sort of actions came about from the people living in those cities, respectively? And how did they respond to Karbala?
So naturally, the response was mixed response, right? So Sham, when you look at Sham, Sham was under the Banu Umayyad.
Yeah.
Not much change came from Sham per se. When you look at Kufa and Medina, or Kufa and Hijaz in specific, these cities realized how much. Um, let's not forget, when Yazid behaves the way he behaved in Karbala, his
Mm,
first crime was Karbala, right? His second crime was Medina.
yeah.
He
Yeah.
violated the city of Medina. And then his third crime was that he violated the city of Mecca. Um, Scholars, when they explain about why he attacks the city of Medina, the reason is because, you know, the city of Medina realized, they knew that the authority of the Banu Umayyah was an illegitimate authority. Goes back to the hadith of the Prophet, where the Prophet used to openly say and repeat constantly. He would say, the Khilafah will never or should never come into the hands of the Banu Umayyah. And if it does, it is a very illegitimate authority that they have. So the
Mm,
people of Medina grew up listening to the Prophet say this constantly over and over again. So they knew that the Banu Umayyah had no legitimacy whatsoever. And obviously, they supported the Prophet and they gave him so much support that they were able to overpower Mecca and hence the Banu Umayyah and so on and so forth. So that's why Yazid was so much prompted towards attacking Medina. When he comes towards Mecca, again, he attacks the city of Mecca because the hatred that he has towards Islam and the message of Tawheed in general. So when you have these attacks towards Mecca and Medina, when you have these attacks in Hijaz, people naturally, they responded very negatively towards his authority. And this goes into the whole discussion of the revolutions that took place after Karbala, right?
yeah.
Um, so, at the time of Amir al-Mu'minin, you had the revolutions of the Khawarij. We spoke about that last week. Many of them were ignored. In fact, all of them were ignored. None of them took it seriously. But then after Karbala takes place, people are now moved by the revolution of Imam Hussein. People started to see the revolution of the Imam with sympathy. The motives were completely different here, right? So there were many revolutions that
Mm,
were taking place to fight against oppression, persecution, starvation, and so on and so forth. Um, when you had these small, small snippets of revolutions taking place, the Banu Umayyah were trying to gather forces, armament to try and subdue these small uprisings. And no one was willing to join them. No one was willing to volunteer and join the movement of the Banu Umayyah, right? Because they all knew what type of people, what type of government they were, except for the people of Sham. So majority of the soldiers that were there actively fighting for the Banu Umayyah were the people of Sham, right? But Hijaz, Kufa, Iraq, none of them actively volunteered to support the Banu Umayyah. Then you
yeah.
have the number of revolutions. You have the Tabi'in, for example, the repentance. The Tabi'in, those who were there in Karbala but refused to join or those who actively chose to turn away from Karbala and not support the Imam alayhi salam, mostly
Mm,
from the people of Kufa, the remorse, the guilt for not joining the Imam alayhi salam. As a result, what happened was they began to gather. and they gathered with the intention to avenge Imam Husayn alayhi salam. Uh, from behind the veil, their followers began to increase more and more. When Yazid dies, when Yazid dies, um, their movement became more public. So a lot of people joined their movement,
Right.
their uprising. When Yazid dies, what happens is that the people of Kufa, they actively dispose of his governor in Kufa, the Umayyad governor of Kufa. They dispose of him, they send him out of Kufa, they drive him out of Kufa, and they replace one of them, one of their own. 4 years later, 4 years later, so when this governor was replaced by by one of their own,
Yeah.
Kufa naturally became a liberated city, not from the uh, control of the Banu Umayyah. 4 years later, after Karbala, um, a bunch of these people, they go towards the city of Syria. They go towards Syria and they fight the Banu Umayyah. They openly fight the Banu Umayyah. They don't fight or seek vengeance against the governors of the Banu Umayyah. Sorry, the people of Syria, right? Their attack is not towards the people of Syria, but towards the government of Syria. So the narrations explain that when they left Kufa to go towards Sham, they left with the intention knowing that they won't return, right? Similar to what happened in Karbala. The people of Karbala, the martyrs of Karbala, knew that there was no return for them. Likewise here, the Tabi'in, when they left Kufa to go towards Sham, they knew that they would not return, and at least 4,000 of them were killed. They wanted to rectify their mistakes. That was their fuel. That was their driving force. And then you had, for example, the revolution of the people of Medina.
Yeah.
Again, it was different from Kufa. Their motives was different. The motives of the people of Kufa was to rectify their mistakes against Imam Hussein, but the motives of the people of Medina was to try and limit the control of the oppressions of the Banu Umayyah, to try and deplete the oppression, the effects of oppression. And Bibi Zainab here, alayhi salam, plays a vital role, right? She began rallying the people of Medina to fight against the Bani Umayyah. Um, they were successful to a certain degree because they were able to expel the Umayyad leader as well as his entourage, as well as his supporters out of the city of Medina, and of course they were exiled towards Sham. Um, they were threatened for their actions, right? They were severely threatened, but they didn't dissuade, they didn't retract their position. And obviously, their uprising led to many, many deaths as well. And then you had the small uprisings as well. For example, the uprising of Abdullah ibn Zubair, which takes place 4 years after Karbala. And then you have the uprising of Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, which happens 5 years after Karbala. And then the revolt of Matlaf against Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi. And then obviously Hajjaj, his history is a very uh, it's a very disgusting history. He was a disgusting person, a killer of the Shias of the Ahlulbayt alayhi salam. The revolt of Ibn As'ad against Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, the revolt of Zayd, the son of Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam as well. And you had many of these small revolts that began to take place. The consequence of this was that it weakened the authority of the Banu Umayyah, right? Um, it significantly weakened their authority. And we mentioned this last week, right? At the time of Imam
Yes.
Sadiq alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq lived through 10 of the caliphs of the Banu Umayyah. So 10 members of the Banu Umayyah, that's not normal, as we mentioned last week. So it showed how weakened they had become. And as a result, obviously, in the time of Imam Sadiq, the Banu Abbas, final revolution of the Banu Abbas,
And that's the slogan that they used, didn't they?
yeah,
Vengeance against Imam Hussein, and that's how they rallied the people
exactly.
against the Banu Umayyah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Ahsant.
Sheikh, thank you so much for your time. I believe that's all that we have in store for today. Thank you all to the MKSI, to the viewers of the MKSI Leicester YouTube channel for joining in for this fourth session in the series title and exposition of Ashura, where we have been discussing the events leading up to the Battle of Karbala, but more so the aftermath and the consequence. And we will be back, inshallah, next week, bringing the next subtopic of the series. Sheikh, thank you so much for your time. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all that we had to offer and find, inshallah, and allow us more opportunities to learn from one another. And finally, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the 12th Imam, and when he does so, that we are also part of his ashab and ansar. Jazakallah, Sheikh. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.